Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian angle on what's going on in the world. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, the BB&T Professor of Free Enterprise Leadership and Ethics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I understand school has started. You're going back to work for a change after a summer of relaxation and rest and stuff?
Absolutely. It's time to once more into the breach and to be molding those moldy young minds.
All right, well, let's talk about a moldy program, one that's been with us for a long time, at least since the 1930s during the leftist regime of President Franklin Roosevelt, and is part of his New Deal revolution that revolutionized America's economic system to a welfare state, is what we call it. And that program is Social Security. It's a program that has been part of American culture. People have become accustomed to it. But really, Richard, from a libertarian perspective, there's really no way to reconcile Social Security with a free society. And we libertarians want to achieve a free society, and so there's obviously a choice that has to be made. If Social Security is irreconcilable with a free society, then if we want a free society, a genuinely free society, that necessarily entails the elimination of this program as well as all other welfare state programs. Because we're talking about a mandatory charity program. The government is mandating that young people care for seniors, or in terms of the whole welfare state, that people care for farmers with farm subsidies, or care for people that are on food stamps, or even foreign aid to dictators. That's a welfare program for them. And it's all based on force. And of course, forcing people to care for others is exactly opposite to libertarian principles. And so the choice really has to be made. I mean, do you want security or do you want freedom? Because contrary to popular opinion and what a lot of people think, there's no fund. There's never been a fund. You don't put your money into a retirement account. We often hear people saying, I put my money into the system for 30 years or whatever. Or there's a contract. I made a contract with the state. Well, no, there's no contract. You'll search your files in vain looking for a contract that you signed with the president or something, and there's no fund. You don't put your money into a fund. It's just a straight taxing program that the government taxes people to fund the entire welfare state, for that matter, the warfare state, which is really kind of a military welfare dole. And so the way I figure it is, Richard, we libertarians, we want a free society. I mean, that's our goal, as a free society. And we can spend our time attacking the easy welfare programs like aid to the arts or food stamps like conservatives do. But I really liked the approach that Milton Friedman made in his book, Capitalism and Freedom, where he had that essay on occupational licensure. To attack occupational licensure, it's possible that you can, criticize the licensing of hairdressers or licensing of whatever. But Friedman said no. If we're going to attack something that needs to be attacked and needs to be eradicated, it's best to take the strongest position. And so he attacked occupational licensure for physicians, because that's obviously the one that is the most powerful example of government licensure. A lot of people are just scared to death with the idea of eliminating licensure for doctors, while they would feel comfortable with eliminating licensure for hairdressers. So Friedman says, no, let's take the crown jewel and show why that should be eliminated, and then everything underneath it falls into place. And I think that's what we need to do on Social Security. What libertarians need to do is you take the crown jewel, which of the whole welfare state, which obviously is Social Security, to a secondary extent Medicare and Medicaid, and we go after them directly and argue why this crown jewel of the welfare state is the eradication of it is a absolutely necessary prerequisite to achieving the free society. What do you think?
Well, let me, maybe for some viewers and listeners, because you were saying some people think they made a contract or there's this pot of gold waiting for them that they have accumulated through the government. So let me sort of step back and point out some things that maybe not every viewer and listener may be as familiar with as you and I. And that is that the Social Security system was set up, as you said, in the mid-1930s, 1935, and it was presented as a program in which people would be making contributions, tax collected, compulsorily taken out of people's salaries, and that this would somehow be accumulated for them and would be maintained, invested in government bonds to be earning interest income, and that when you reach some retirement age, you in a sense would be drawing down upon your own money the same way as if you had had a private savings account, put away a growing nest egg out of each paycheck, and then when your golden years came, you have this large savings account that has been accumulating interest income, and then you draw off your savings for hopefully a blissful and comfortable retirement. Now, the fact is that is not how the system has worked. From the start, the government began issuing Social Security cards. People started reaching retirement age. And the government had to be using some of the money collected today to be paying those early people who are either at or just approaching retirement age. So it has always been at its core an intergenerational redistribution of wealth system from the working population of today to the retired population. Now, it is a fact that for many decades, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s, and so on, given the demographics of the proportion of the U.S. population working relative to the proportion of the population retired or retiring, there were approximately, if I remember, it depends on what decade you're talking about, but let's suppose the 1950s and 60s, there were approximately 4 or 5 working people for every one retired person. So 4 or 5 people were paying in their out-of-income earned Social Security taxes, and the government was accumulating this Social Security trust fund. And there were fewer people that it had to pay out to than money coming in. Now, what the government was doing all those decades was running budget deficits for the most part. And the federal government overall had to cover its budget deficit. So what was done, and this was all legal, no shenanigans in the fraudulent sense, in terms of the rules of how the trust fund was set up, any surpluses in the Social Security account were, quote, lent to the rest of Uncle Sam. In other words, the Social Security surpluses were invested in U.S. government bonds and securities. And titles to those are what have been in that metaphorical lockbox. And then, therefore, the surpluses in Social Security were used to fund other government programs having nothing to do with retirement for current government expenditures for the annual budget deficits. So this has been continuing on, but the problem is that the demographics of the U.S. economy has been changing, Jacob, as I know you know. So that now you basically have only between 3 and 4 people working to pay in to cover the expenses of those who are either collecting or are now approaching collecting Social Security. And given the demographic trends, the situation is that within the next 2-3 decades, at the most, about 20 years, there's only going to be approximately 2 to 3 workers paying in to pay for one retired person's Social Security benefits. So much so is this demographic trend changing that, for example, the Congressional Budget Office, basically these are economic and statistical policy wonks hired by Congress. They're supposed to be nonpartisan, and they do sort of just the statistical analysis of what the consequences are of proposed or existing legislation in terms of costs and revenues and so on. And they basically say is that we are now in a situation where not only is there not enough money coming into the Social Security fund to cover the cost of those retired. But the Social Security fund has been having to turn in its U.S. government bond IOUs for repayment, so it has enough cash to pay out Social Security beneficiaries. There's the additional problem, Jacob, that the Social Security fund is now drawing down more and more of those IOUs that the rest of the government owes to its own Social Security department. So that the Congressional Budget Office has estimated that in about 10 or 15 years at the most, and I should emphasize, they tend to make these get these predictions wrong. In other words, the situation turns out to be worse and sooner than they are initially projecting. That in about 10 or 15 years, given the taxes are not high enough and the IOUs in the block box will have been, quote, paid back, that under current legislation, it will be necessary for the Social Security Fund to reduce monthly benefits, then the total number of legal recipients, by anywhere from 20 to 25%. So in other words, if you are on Social Security getting $100 a month, let's say, just for the example, simple number, $100 a month, then after day X, according to the Congressional Budget Office, in 10 or 15 years, when your check comes, it's only going to be $75. That's the very nature of the system. The system, by its own basis, is going bankrupt. Now, what are the solutions that the government suggests? Which are the ones you say are just, shifting things around without the fundamental issues being dealt with, as you said. Well, you raise Social Security taxes for the working age population paying in. You increase the retirement age so that you have to be older to be eligible to collect Social Security, okay? Or you cut the benefits, or some combination of the three, or at least two of them. So the fact is that the system is going bankrupt. It's not a matter of just a philosophical discussion of, well, should people plan their own retirement, or should government be covering all or part of the retirement? Just as a pragmatic, fiscal, financial bottom line thing, the system is going bankrupt. This means that the very question that you're raising has to now be dealt with, not as an abstract issue, but as a concrete matter. What will people do when they are either in or approaching retirement, given this? The system cannot be fixed without harming more people, imposing more coercive and compulsory taxes on some, continuing to lie to people that there's a benefits promise that will be guaranteed when they will not. So the issue now confronting us is what is to replace it. Now we can't try the Band-Aids and the fix-its, or we can deal with the fundamental issue that you're talking about, Jacob. And that is to ask the question, is this system ethically right and economically the best for people to be able to try to plan for their own retirement future or their loved ones? And the answer is, it should be left to private enterprise, private sector, individual decision making. Many people have pointed out that if you had not been taxed all of the Social Security dollars and it had been left in your own private hands, hadn't been earned by you, and just put into the stock market or some 401k or any other type of investment package, on average and in general, most people would have been accumulating large amounts of money, given interest returns, and admittedly with the ups and downs of the general trends of economic growth of the economy as a whole and financial markets. In other words, you have had this money taken from you, they took it without your consent, they wasted it on covering current government expenditures through this little sleight of hand that they take the money and they put in a government IOU for other government spending. And these people are now being left out to dry. What we need to do is to realize that the system was from its beginning a lie and going to be economically unsustainable in the long run, and to devise the method to proceed with its abolition, its repeal, its elimination, and to use it as one of those examples of that we take from the past of failed and bankrupt policies and institutions that we learn from not to do again.
All right, let's go back to 28 years ago, Richard. You and I were starting the Future of Freedom Foundation. Um, you were vice president of academic affairs. I was the president, and our mission at that time, which is still our mission, is to present the uncompromising case for the free society, or libertarianism. And part of that was, as you'll recall, we were calling for the repeal of and the abolition of income taxation, the IRS, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, legalization of drugs, stopping foreign interventionism. It was the radical pure case for the free society. And there were a lot of people who would not support us. They were in their 30s. You and I were almost 40, I guess, late 30s. And there were a lot of people who said, that's just too radical. Now, we were successful in attracting a small group of people that said, yeah, that's what a free society is all about. That's what freedom is all about. And this is a foundation that is trying to achieve the genuinely free society, which necessarily entails the elimination of the infringements on freedom. But there were a lot of people, as you recall, that said, no, can't go with you. I mean, that's just too radical. We need this welfare warfare state, including the CIA and the Pentagon and Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. Well, now here we are 30 years later, or almost 30 years later, and people they were in their 30s back then that said, hey, you guys are too radical, I can't go with you, are now saying, oh, well, gosh, the state took all my money from me and has left me, with very little for retirement. But let's face it, a lot of them were supporting the system over the past 30 years, that they're now lamenting the fact that it took their money. And we used to say, periodically during those 28 years, I would say, look, if you guys would just join up with us and help us abolish like the income tax and the IRS, think how much money you would have for your retirement, for your health care, and so forth. And you could add it up over the past 20 years. How much have you paid in income taxes for the past 20 years? I mean, people have maybe $400,000, $500,000 in their bank account plus interest. Now, I have a little bit different take from you on this. I don't think there ever was a fund. It wasn't intended as a fund. This was a straight welfare program. I mean, is there a fund for food stamp recipients? Is there a fund for farm subsidies? Is there a fund for foreign aid to dictators? No, there's no fund at all. Now, this was established as a straight welfare program for the elderly. They disguised it in terms of a Social Security tax, but what you call a tax is irrelevant. That they needed money to fund this program. That before government can give money to a person, it has to raise it through taxation, and that means force. So they could have called it an income tax. Hey, let's have an expanded income tax to fund this welfare program, Social Security, as well as other programs. They fudged the issue by saying, hey, let's call it a Social Security tax. But the fact is, it was just a tax to fund the welfare program. It was never intended as a retirement fund where they put money into it. Now, they call it a fund today, but it's a sham. It's a fraud. I mean, it's like, let's say I've got $20,000 in cash for my kid's first year at college, and it's locked up in my safe at home. Well, one day I take it out and I go spend it on a vacation, but I replace it with IOUs, saying I owe my son $20,000 here. Well, my son comes to me, if I had a son, and said, hey, how's my college retirement fund doing? Oh, it's great. It's fully funded. It's got that IOU in it. Well, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's just a sham. Now, the question, though, is really, what do we do now, Richard? And my position is that no one has a right to the continuation of an entitlement program or any welfare program. Congress has the authority to repeal any law. Nobody has a right to say, oh, well, no, I was promised that this welfare law would stay into perpetuity. And so 28 years ago, when you and I started FFF, there were people there, seniors, you'll recall, saying, this is outrageous that you would try to abolish this program after I, quote, put my money in or had it taken out for 30 years. And now here we are, almost 30 years later, with seniors saying the same thing. Oh, this isn't fair. Well, if you take that position, then we can never achieve freedom, Because there's always going to be seniors that are at the margin going into 65 years old and becoming eligible for Social Security. So if that's the case, we can never achieve the free society. And that's what we got to keep in mind here. Is this system reconcilable with the genuine principles of freedom? And we know that it's not. It's based on forcing people to care for others. When you've got a system that's forcing people to care for others, that is opposite to freedom. So if we really want the free society, people have to make a choice here. Do you want security through Social Security, Medicare, and so forth, or do you want the free society? Now, to me, I'm indifferent. Whether somebody goes on Social Security, Medicare, uses the post office, uses the roads, that's a decision that people make on a personal basis. But even if you're on Social Security, that does not preclude you from openly and publicly and within your own self calling for the repeal of this program. And that's what I think everyone that wants the free society has to do. That if you genuinely want freedom, you've got to support the elimination of infringements on freedom. And that's the choice that I think everybody faces here at this point in our lives. Do you want security or do you want freedom? Because you can't have both. You have to have one or the other. And so I say freedom is what matters, not security. That's what I want.
Our dilemma, of course, in the United States and the real world is that most people don't want freedom. They say they want freedom. They want to watch TV. They want to go on a vacation. They want to be able to enjoy time with their friends and so on and so forth. But the fact is that our dilemma is that most Americans don't want freedom. That's our task and our role in espousing the ideas of liberty and re-persuade people's minds. Yes, Social Security must be abolished. I have, in the past, made the following way of making this more palatable for people, given that they are afraid of freedom. It is estimated, again, by the Social Security Trust Fund, that the present value of all promised Social Security benefits based upon current legislation and demographic trends is approximately $36 trillion. A few years ago, I looked at all of what the United States government owns in the country: land, grazing fields, mineral rights under the ground, so on and so forth. And if you add them up, and if the government were to sell it off, it would come out to about between $30 and $40 trillion. So to get two birds with one stone, I would suggest is to sell off all government land and take the revenues received from it and return ill-gotten gains to those who have been plundered, starting with the oldest people collecting Social Security, demographically down through the age brackets, and just pay back their money by selling off government lands. You do two things. You ameliorate the horror and the fear that people have in mind. Well, the thief stole your money, here's some of the stolen money. And the second thing is, you privatize the 1/4 of the United States in terms of land and property that the U.S. government owns. So you ameliorate people's fear of Social Security by returning their money to them to the extent that you can, and you have privatized the 1/4 of the territory of the United States that the U.S. government owns. Two birds with one stone. That's my proposal. But the end product of it is the one that you're proposing. Social Security will be gone. And then people will have to make their own choices. The separation of retirement decision from the state. What will I do with my currently earned income? Or any money that I have received as restitution from earlier government thievery? How shall I invest it? Where shall I invest it? Will I think of tomorrow or not? But those are the issues of personal responsibility that cannot be developed and taken seriously until and through people have to for themselves.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that, when people say, oh my gosh, I wouldn't survive without Social Security, is that the government has inculcated this mindset of dependency on people. I mean, it's made people believe that they couldn't survive without this. I have no doubt that if there was a button right here that if I pushed it, it would abolish Social Security and the rest of the welfare state. I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to push it because I believe in people. God has created resilient human beings. People adjust. And let's keep in mind that Americans live without Social Security and other socialism for more than 100 years. And they had a much lower standard of living than a much lower degree of wealth than Americans today have. And there's no instances of elderly dying in the streets from starvation and so forth. I mean, young people would be free to keep everything they earn. That's a big pool of money to help your parents out. There's also foundations that would come into existence to help the former Social Security recipients, where people could donate to those. Some people might have to go back to work, but everybody would adjust in a free society. And that's what we got to do, is reignite that belief in freedom, that freedom really works. You don't have to fear it. Now, on your proposal, in theory, I don't have any problem with it. I certainly wouldn't make it conditional, because then you have to convince two groups of people. One, to abolish Social Security, which, as you suggest, is not an easy task. And then another group of people that wants to keep the national parks and wants to keep the national lands. But I mean, if you did sell off these federal lands, and I'm all in favor of that, I mean, another classic socialist program there, then my argument is, why should seniors be given any priority here? I mean, why not all taxpayers? Why give priority to food stamp recipients or anybody else? And then it is a complex thing. If you're going to reimburse taxpayers, you have to calculate all the money that they've paid for their lives. And what about deceased people? Do you factor them into the equation and their heirs? So it's not an easy task to decide if those lands are sold, who gets the money and how it gets the money. But I think that the primary focus should be is this: do you want freedom or not? Okay, that's the first question. And the second question is, what is freedom? Well, from a libertarian standpoint, freedom is the right to keep everything you own, your own money, and you decide what to do with it. That no coerced charity at all. And again, that's what Social Security is. It's taking money from young people and forcibly giving it to seniors. Now, when you talk about the system going bankrupt, all that's saying is that young people cannot be taxed enough to fund this massive welfare program for seniors. But I mean, you could theoretically tax young people 60-70% of their income, 80% of their income. I mean, when you talk about bankruptcy, all you're really saying is that young people cannot handle the tax burden of this large class of people. My argument is that we've got to be thinking in terms of the moral case. You and I are 68 now, Richard. When we started FFF, we were in our late 30s. It looks like, we got a long time to achieve the free society here. Statistically speaking, you and I have less time to achieve what we really want to achieve, and that's the free society. We don't have the luxury of time like we did in our 30s. And if a free society genuinely consists of a society where people are free to keep everything they earn and decide for themselves what to do with it, no mandated charity, then we have to face people with this choice: is what do you want? Do you want a free society, or do you want the society based on security? Security versus liberty, and security entails social security. And if you choose, well, Jacob, I want security, well, then we resign ourselves that we're not going to get the free society. But you're right, most people don't want freedom. But that doesn't mean that properly understood, tomorrow they might not change their mind. And the only way they're going to change their mind, or the only way we're going to get enough people to call for the genuinely free society, is by making the case for the free society and eliminating this fear that people have that, oh my gosh, people will be dying in the streets, and without Medicare, everybody will be dying of illness and so forth. We've got to inculcate that belief in freedom, that freedom is not only right, but it really does work. It produces a better, freer, more prosperous, more charitable, more moral, more ethical society.
See, the dilemma we face, you use the analogy that if there was a button in front of you that would make all these government programs go away, you would push the button. Now, in fact, that analogy was first used by Leonard E. Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, in 1946 at a talk that he gave at the Detroit Economics Club around the time that FEE was founded in 1946. And he said if there was a button on the podium, he would push it to make the welfare state go away, all the other programs. But he then went on to say that the next day they would all be back. The reason they would all be back is the point that you're talking about. And that is people are unwilling to accept the responsibilities, the burdens, the aspects of liberty that those freedoms require. The result being, and that is why he set up FEE, that is why you set up the Future Freedom Foundation, why I have undertaken a lot of the activities and writings and speaking that I do, because the dilemma that people must face is, do they want a controlled and command society in which their lives are under the thumb of others? Or do they want to have a society in which they make these decisions for themselves with the honestly earned fruits of their own labor? We have now had decades of people inculcated, indoctrinated, growing up intergenerationally with this presumption that the state will care for them in these various and sundry ways. The result of this is that we have to re-educate the American people. Now, sometimes crises are useful for this. And this is a crisis that is emerging. The fact that the money is running out. You can't avoid facing it. There's no longer much of a road on which to kick the can. This means that the very crisis, that the lack of funding under the rules and the legislative and the revenue procedures of Social Security, are making people now, or very soon, having to ask these questions. Am I to rely upon a system that has lied to me, promised me things that are not available now or not going to be soon available? And therefore, how should I live? What should I depend upon? What is my responsibility as a person? What should be my relationships to others in society? And in that context, what is the role of government? The classic liberal, the libertarian, basically says that the individual has inherent and unalienable rights, life, liberty, honestly acquired property, that human relationships should be based upon peaceful and voluntarily and mutually agreed upon terms of all associations and relationships, and that the role of government is to secure those liberties and not to violate or intrude upon them. But crises are useful times because it starkly makes people have to confront realities. And this fundamental is one of them. This fundamental one is one of them. And this Social Security crisis that is now really just over the horizon may be one of those teaching moments to get people to rethink the very type of issue that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great point, because you can see the crises with socialism in Venezuela. You can see it in Greece and Italy and other welfare states where the amount of spending gets so large and the amount of debt. And of course, we all know about debt here in the United States with the federal debt rising exorbitantly, that with crisis comes opportunity. And that opportunity is to convince people that this whole socialist way of life is wrong and destructive, and that the best solution, the only solution, is freedom and libertarianism. So on that note, Richard, we're out of time. Enjoyed the conversation with you, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, thank you to our viewers and listeners for once more giving a little bit of their time to spend it with us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Come and see us at fff.org and subscribe to our daily newsletter, FFF Daily, which we strive to make the best daily libertarian commentary page on the internet, and of course our monthly journal, Future Freedom, and Libertarian Angle. Okay, Richard, see you next week.
Until next time.